and I'll turn it over to you to get us started.
Thank you. So I'm filling in for Dr. Ruth Gomer, and to be honest, I wanted to just give a brief overview of like the background of like U.S. immigration and imperialism. It won't be her panel exactly, but you know, forgive me. So a few of the factors that really drive immigration to this country that we can, I'm sure, think of. One is economic instability. 2 is armed conflict. 3 is lack of resources, and 4 is escaping environmental disasters. These crises are not just acts of God, but they're often the result of U.S. imperialism. And I'm going to give the example of like Mexico, for example. For many years, I mean, half of Mexico was basically taken by the United States. And what has ensued has been this like relationship based on essentially like domination, extraction, exploitation, and migration has always been a part of it. Y'all probably heard the expression, we didn't cross the border crossed us. And there's a real thing there that, you know, you can trace something back as soon as like, even just like the implementation of NAFTA, that was supposed to be a promising economic arrangement between these two countries, but the reality of like, you know, the masses in Mexico was very different. NAFTA allowed for example, corn produced in the U.S. to flood the market in Mexico. Corn here in this country is heavily subsidized by the government, and corn in Mexico is actually, it's a national crop. It's something that for thousands of years people have been cultivating and cultivated a heterogeneous variety of corn. But farmers in Mexico can actually compete with the low price of American corn. So what does that do? Well, people who used to make a living, for example, in agriculture farming corn, they can't anymore. And it results in their dispossession. They end up looking where for work? Well, their neighbor up north. And this pattern of seasonal migrant labor ends up being like a big, you know, driving force for people. And that's just one example, and that's just Mexico. We look all over Central America, and there's armed, you know, the result of armed conflicts that drive people to leave. El Salvador, Guatemala, environmental disasters like earthquakes, droughts, famines. And, you know, finally, it's also like the US's heavy-handed intervention does drive people to leave. The invasion of Iraq, for example, led to 4 million displaced people. The sanctions and attacks on Venezuela to date have led to almost 8 million people fleeing the country. Droughts in Central America's dry corridor, extreme weather events caused by U.S. imperialism and the consumption of resources for these like hungry imperialist nations. This is all driving people out of their homes and to the belly of the beast. To give a very brief overview, on the other hand, of U.S. policy on immigration post 9/11, the Department of Defense, the Department of Homeland Security, Immigration and Customs Enforcement itself was only formed in 2003. This hasn't been around forever, not even 30 years. And the primary aims of DHS and ICE have been to remove unauthorized persons in the U.S. and stop border crossings of unauthorized migrants. But the way this has actually been practiced has been fueled by xenophobia, racism, that both Republican and Democratic administrations have been behind. They've used ICE. Barack Obama was dubbed like the deporter-in-chief. But in more recent years, you know, Trump's first administration, second administration, things have really ramped up. And I don't really mean that in terms of like raw numbers, because Obama still takes a lead there, but in flair and pageantry and just this ridiculous show of force, it's driven people into a lot of fear. Work that was previously done in the dark, these kinds of immigration, deportations, they've decided to go right out into broad daylight and committing these horrible atrocities that we see all over the country. But I want to take a step back and talk a little bit about what it's actually like to cross the border. The annual death rate for people crossing into the US has been about 1,000 people per year for the last several years. 1,107 people drowned while crossing the Rio Grande between 2017 and 2023. The border wall pushes people to take even more dangerous routes. Dora Rodriguez, an immigrant rights activist who was born in El Salvador, crossed on the border in 1980, but not everyone on her trip made it. 13 of the roughly 30 people in the group died from lack of water, heat, and sun exposure. And she even recalls people drinking perfume to survive. What the reality is like for undocumented people in the US, sometimes I think of it as out of the frying pan into the fire. People don't just leave their countries for no reason. People don't just uproot from their ways of life, haul ass across multiple countries or continent, and end up here for no reason. People are really driven by the instability of their countries, the lack of opportunity, violence, either political violence, gang violence, domestic violence. And there's a certain image of the US exports around the world of what it is. It's a land of opportunity, it's a land of freedom. And the reality here is so much different than that. And it's something that people don't really have an awareness of all the time. But it's something they confront when they get here. From, the threat of deportation, which is the moment you step into this country, to the exploitation at work and in apartments. For example, a Chicago landlord called ICE and the building was raided as a means to clear out the tenants so he could revamp the building and raise the rent. These very cynical uses of the immigration system to push people out. They're basically treated as vermin by society. Trump's attacks against undocumented people are on record. We've all heard that rhetoric. And just this has created such vast fear that is very difficult to break people out of. And for good reason. None of this stuff is just in people's heads. None of this stuff can really be glossed over through reforms or whatever. It's baked into the DNA of this country that immigrants are always a population that has been seen as exploitable. And once they're not able to exploit them on their terms, the way they like, or it's not as profitable to exploit them, they are expelled. But it's a cycle. And so, in response to this, Dare to Struggle, which many of you are probably familiar with, launched at the beginning of this year, a Spring Search to Belfast. And this is because there's been a real shift in what we've seen masses of people do from the summer to the fall to the winter. Starting last summer, there were rebellions in LA in June that really shook the whole country. People saw ICE agents going on a wild rampage out in public, backed by the National Guard. And it really was one of those events, kind of like the Gaza War, I think, that brings into question the legitimacy of these kinds of forces. And in response, where you really saw the masses of people out in the streets of LA, from rebellious youth to just like families, like, as well as, you know, activist people more broadly, but like really stepping into this fight. And then over the fall, the winter, there's these waves of like, you know, walkouts from schools and protests that kind of like ebb and flow and everything, but then Operation Metro Surge hits. And in January, we see an escalation in what people are really willing to do in the face of these like attacks. And that was something that we were seeing, and seeing a real shift in kind of like, well, what are people really willing to do here? They're willing to get in the way, they're willing to stand up. This isn't the usual kind of like march, chant, go home, rinse and repeat. And so we really thought it would be an important opportunity to say, well, it's time to take this further. It's time to like try to like push this as far as it can go, take this energy that people have and really direct it against this immigration system, against the people responsible for this. So the goal of the spring surge is to go on the offensive. No longer should we just be trying to like keep up with the news and respond to shit as it's happening. We really gotta find the ways now, proactively, to be taking this on, head on, tap into the people who've been on the front lines, tap into the masses of people who maybe aren't on the front lines, but really want to support this, really see it as a righteous thing. Tap into the immigrant masses of people in this country who are struck with so much fear, but, you know, in unity there's strength. And there is fear, but what are the ways that we can bring people out or tap into that vital source of resistance? And so far, Dare Struggles led school walkouts. They put on like forums on addressing repression, which is inevitable whenever you stand up against the system. Just last week, we had speak-outs all over the country in immigrant neighborhoods, really trying to bring people out, you know, in this way. Coming up in April, there's going to be people's tribunals put on to put the people who are in power on the stand, put this system that has been just causing all kinds of havoc, exposed, have people who are affected by it testify, and condemn and sentence these criminals. You know, in an overall symbolic gesture, we hope that it can also drive people to action. And then cap things off in May with the celebration of immigrant culture. You know, it's important to root this in really like what it is that moves people and brings people together, and hopefully from there we're at a good launching point to having drawn out and found that mix of people who are really to like take this further and keep this fight going. So that's what I've got.
Thank you, Adrian, for providing some of that larger context. You know, a lot of us have really been buried in the news. We see these updates day after day about what ICE is doing, and it's helpful to have this kind of zoomed out look to understand how we got here, and also a glimpse of, you know, what some of the organizations we're here today have been doing to wage a fight against it. So one thing that's exciting, we're gonna have some photos that Polly has taken from your time up in the Twin Cities displayed. So Adrian's gonna get that set up for us to serve as the backdrop for this conversation. I'm going to slide down. We're just down to one mic, unfortunately. And so, to kind of ground us in this discussion today, I want to start, and while I can start with you, you know, tell us about the global conditions that are driving migration to the U.S. and how these conditions are shaped by U.S. foreign policy, trade policy, sanctions, militarism, and climate policy.
Hi everyone, really good to be here today. I remember in Minneapolis there was that episode, they detail their harrowing journey from the Darien Gap to Chicago to Minneapolis. Of course, it being a mainstream liberal media, they kind of conflate Venezuela with a sort of repressive socialist rule. But in reality, of course, it is the sanctions that have created the conditions for so many of the migrants to come to the U.S. for a better life. I've spoken to a lot of migrants who also use a sort of shorthand about political repression in their home countries as a reason why they came to the U.S. But a lot of them also stop short there, where they don't talk about the U.S. causing a lot of these conditions. I've never really gone public about my own immigration status. I moved to the U.S. 4.5 years ago, and my migration status is in a purgatorial state. And I think, I moved here because I got kicked out of Singapore, which really is the Israel of Southeast Asia. But I came here because I think, by and large, as a journalist, it was better to be here than to be locked up in Singapore, where you will have solitary confinement as a default. You don't have access to a lawyer. I uncovered a secret police unit in Singapore at the age of 19 when I was working for Vice World News. Remember that? But it's still around. But I think a big part of this too is when I speak to other migrants, they also break up climate policies, and what Adrian so expertly talked about just now was, a good example is all these sanctions. And I always go back to this story that I read in this book called The Jakarta Method, where in 1951, JFK, before his presidential run, he does kind of this globe-trotting event where he goes from country to country to talk to world leaders. And there's a story where he was traveling with Patricia and Bobby Kennedy to India to talk to the Prime Minister there, Nehru. And for the entire dinner, he is unimpressed with the future president. And he emphasizes that America has nothing to offer but the status quo, and that communism and socialism gave what was termed the Third World a reason to die for. I think when we look at, say, Cuba and a lot of these places where are victims of U.S. imperialism and sanctions, a lot of mainstream media misses the mark in talking about whose fault exactly that is. So you get very pedestrian discussions about, repression in the home countries, and these sort of global conditions, they drive people here, and they risk their lives to come here, and they find themselves in a dragnet. And I think as we keep talking about migration, and as we keep keeping up with the news, which is the least we could do, we need to remember that this sort of language that we use to discuss migration is pretty surface level across the board until, because it's difficult, right? You talk to somebody who's migrated from Venezuela or Cuba, and they say that, there was repression in their home country, and, it's difficult to be like, well, actually. So, yeah, those, to me, that's what I've noticed and what I've heard about, from my sources and from folks I've interviewed in the Twin Cities, Chicago, New York.
particularly like about like land and agrarian issues that they face, and we just kind of like learn about how it's a lot of like the right-wing paramilitaries that are the ones causing like the majority of the violence, and they are like trained at like the School of the Americas by the United States. And what I actually found out was that it is like them, the Colombian paramilitaries and like military police that train other paramilitary forces and repressive forces in South America and in Latin America because it's like cheaper. And there's also other things like the economic detriment that comes from sanctions, which we spoke about, using it to like undermine the economy, to paint these leaders as, you know, like these dictators and everything, which is just like a lot more complex than, you know, it's painted out to be. And like another thing is climate change. Like the US military is one of the biggest, I think, if not like the biggest polluter on the planet. And that's not really something that's like talked about like the liberal media when it comes to like climate change, like recycling, all of that. It's like the US military, like not only just like the bombing and all the violence that takes place across the world, but like you know, just I was recently in Arizona, and there's like a testing site for like bombs and stuff over there, and on the U.S. Army website they like brag about like over 3,000 like weapons are tested in this area per year, and I'm like, this is just crazy. Like, you know, this is like what happens to the land, what happens to like the people who have to live off the land afterwards, and there's kind of like that through line in like Latin America and other countries that was like Adrian kind of spoke about with like you know, corn and having to kind of navigate the growing and all of that. It's similar in Colombia. They've kind of like ruined the land, forced like this monoculture to kind of take place, and it doesn't just like leave when they leave. It's like it affects the soil. They have to completely, you know, like dig it, like, you know, just like really focus on like repairing the land. And then on top of the fact that like as climate change worsens, you know, the temperatures are changing. This causes people in countries in the global south, like who live in, you know, like poor living conditions, having to like deal with that, like affecting their livelihoods. You know, hurricanes kind of like getting worse. People who live in like shanty towns, along the coast and stuff. It's people that are in the most vulnerable positions that are like affected by this as well. Like, you know, we're really hot and like sweaty, and it's like another record heat kind of wave or whatever. But it's like these people are like losing their homes. They're dying from like just like the levels of like heat and everything over 100 degrees. It just keeps getting worse. So they are trying to kind of like find respite in somewhere else, and in the United States it's painted to be as like this like place to do that. But you know, when they come here, then they face the reality of like violence from within the country, not only from like the state forces, but like, you know, citizens and that kind of thing who are buying into this like far-right fascist agenda, and like where they're inflicting that onto them.
So while you've documented ICE activity, we've seen some of it above us in New York, and have been present in Chicago, Minneapolis during these ICE surges. What are the different forces you've seen at play, both for people who are being targeted by ICE and those who are trying to step in the way
Let's start with Minneapolis. Let's start with how an ICE agent goes about his day. They fly into St. Paul, the airport, and they're picked up by one of their ICE buddies in an unmarked car. And they drive to the Whipple Federal Building. In any incursion, you have the ICE facility, the federal facility, and you have the ICE raids happening, and you have the site of either a killing or a kidnapping. Those three are kind of what your life will revolve around if you're an ICE agent or if you're a journalist covering this. So, let's say that they go somewhere, let's say a Boost Mobile or a laundromat or Mercado, any of these places that they frequently target. And Minneapolis had a pretty robust tracking sort of infrastructure where people would be on a live call almost 24/7 during the incursion. And ICE would try to shake people from following them. Sometimes, and this happened to me and a few friends of ours, reporter friends, where we would follow them and they would guide us, they would lead us on this wild goose chase. I remember on one of the days, it was maybe 5 reporter vehicles, press vehicles, following one car, and we were on a roundabout. We were on that roundabout for 5 minutes, and that pissed off everybody trying to actually get to where they wanted. But sometimes they lead you to a county miles and miles away from Minneapolis or St. Paul, and where the sheriff departments are sympathetic to their deportation machine. And they would pull over on a shoulder, practically daring you to pull over too, but a cop would tail you. The forces I see at play here is that when they chase a migrant into a business and corner them, they're banking on the fact that nobody's going to do anything. They target low-income neighborhoods and those on Main Street, because what is Minneapolis but not a spectacle? I think when we look at how do you think people should respond to those obstacles, that part is a pretty loaded question, because there's this idea that we're not really doing anything to impede the efforts of ICE officers kidnapping people. People surround them, they blow their whistles, and they gas the entire neighborhood. So, I remember in Broadview, I saw a family whose father was taken into the Broadview facility, and they were trying to the family was trying to deliver medication. And I remember the kids, they weren't crying, they were holding their jackets while their mom held their backpacks, and it was obvious that they had just come from school or daycare. I remember thinking to myself, wow, I would be fucked if they arrested me. I'd be deported immediately. But a part of me also figured, what other reason would be better to be deported or to be killed for this? I didn't know those children's names, but I would very willingly die for them. I think that's a question that is difficult for a lot of the American public, which is, are you willing to die for this? You can pop at the tires, go get a new car. You can get arrested, charges are dropped in a couple of weeks, you're released the same day or the next day. So, yes, you can impede their operations, but these are band-aids. And in Federal Plaza in New York, where there was a dragnet at the immigration court, there have been people filing habeas corpus petitions to get people out immediately. I think when we talk about how do we respond to these obstacles, and I'll make this quick. I remember the day Alex Freddie was killed. I called my friend from Michigan, and he heard about paused for a second and he said, fuck man, even our martyrs can't get a shot off. So I think, and this is like, anyone here is a fan, but like, arm yourself. If you're gonna bring a gun out, use it. And I think, and this is very different for a lot of people here, is that if you're not gonna use it, then why do you have a gun? So, yeah, I think still impede how Minneapolis impeded, but you have to make these ICE agents scared for their life. You have to make that $50,000 signing bonus seem like peanuts compared to what they have to go through if they're willing to stand up and fight.
So, Jackie, you were arrested for protesting against ICE this past October, which has been a part of a very large wave of mass repression against anti-ICE protesters. Can you share more about why you were protesting ICE, why you fought your charges, and what you think your role in fighting repression plays in the fight against
like change happen. You know, we see with the Prairie Land 19 over in Texas, like they were there protesting this like act of defiance, but they got like this whole repressive state apparatus sick on them, and it just goes to show that like you want to stand up, you want to fight back, but like we need to bring people like along with us. And if the defiant ones keep facing these like challenges and this repression, and they're jailed, detained, killed, deported, like where is the guidance to kind of lead this mass movement? So it's really important to kind of like fight this like with all that you can, and to bring it to light, which is why like now that it's over and I've kind of made it past like the charges being dropped, like I'm like trying to speak out about it as much as I can, because I'm like, this can't be swept under the rug. Like they're coming, like even for, you know, me, like to my aunts and uncles, I'm like, it was me, like, you know, you see this on the news and everything, but like it could be you, it could be, you know, like my cousin, could be me, and it was, and we need to like, you know, build the numbers on top of like fighting this.
And this is for Wally. I'm curious what you think we can learn from the waves of resistance that has greeted these ICE thugs across the country. What should we take inspiration from? What are the things that we should leave behind?
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that I learned while covering the ICE incursions across the country is, who here has heard of Alanis Garcia? Just raise your hands if you've heard of that name. A couple of you. I'm sure many more have heard of Silverio Gonzalez. I think that's a problem. As a migrant, when I look at this response, I remember I booked a flight to Minneapolis after the standoff between a couple of roofers and ICE, which lasted 4.5 hours, and eventually one of the migrants collapsed, and they handcuffed him in the ambulance. I booked my flight to Minneapolis. I remember it costed like $90 to go from New York to there. The day Renee Good was killed was the day after I booked that flight. The prices shot up like $450. You know, everybody and their dogs wanted to go there to take photos, to cover it, and to protest. And I think a big part of this is, you know, there's this feeling that I get from America where migrants like Silverio or Alanis Garcia, who was chased off of a building at the Glass House raid in LA and died, we're supposed to die. Some people are supposed to die. I think when we look at this immigration struggle, it's not enough that people believe what they want to believe, or believe the right thing. They have to believe it for the right reason. I think that's the root of it. I look at the waves of resistance that I saw in Minneapolis, and I think what we need to leave behind is, you know, a good example is I went to Springfield, Ohio, where temporary protected status is at risk for Haitian migrants. ICE isn't there yet, but once that expires, and thankfully it's been extended multiple times, ICE will move in. It is the place for them to hit. And I remember during the debate when Trump was saying that the reunion dogs are getting the cats. That was one of the moments I was like, oh fuck, he's gonna win. But I remember talking to a faith leader, his name's Carl Ruby. He was in DC recently because they were hearing arguments in the Supreme Court about whether or not it was legal to deport Haitian migrants or here at TPS. And I remember sitting in the church and interviewing him. Also, by the way, there's nothing to do with Springfield, Ohio. So, I interviewed a lot of faith leaders there, and I remember him saying that, and this is one of those things we should leave behind, where he said that he wasn't, all the migrants that he knew were law-abiding, and they worked hard. I don't care if they're law-abiding. I don't care if they work hard. It could be the biggest fucking loser, and they have a right to it. When you look at, let's go to Vietnam. I know I'm going all over the place. Ho Chi Minh, when he made an appeal on the global stage after the Japanese occupation of Vietnam, used language from the American Constitution, talking about inalienable rights, about the rights to be happy, to be free. He was appealing directly to America. And I think a lot of migrants are appealing directly to America right now. When I look at these surges, there is a search on the mainstream media angle of this for perfect victims. And even then, it's not enough. Martinez is a school teacher who got shot multiple times, and yet the only coverage we've seen on it, which was covered deeply, is on Block Club and sometimes in Chicago, sometimes. Tiny teams. I mean, she did, mainstream media was actually a few weeks late to the Chicago incursion, as they are most places. But I do think that there are things to learn from Minneapolis. There has to be this infrastructure that is already there to track these ICE agents. But we need to ask ourselves, to what end? Can we actually stop these ICE agents from grabbing people who, again, I don't care if there's a criminal record or not. There were times in Minneapolis where I would be on the rapid response call. And a lot of journalists that thought I was crazy for speaking into the call on signal because they think that we shouldn't interfere at all. But no, if I'm the only car on the street, I'm gonna call in the plate. This is basic. But I remember, and this is so vivid in my head, where we tracked a car down to Longfellow, this neighborhood in Minneapolis, and we wait there, and people are freaking out on the call, and somebody says, "Oh, it's a targeted raid." And everybody was like, "Oh, okay, never mind them, they're just doing it." And I was like, holy fucking shit. Like, if we can accept that a lot of people are incarcerated wrongfully, and why is it that people stop caring when ICE is doing what they're supposed to do? That doesn't make any sense to me. And I always hear people say they're untrained. Can you imagine these fuckers were actually trained? It'd be worse, And I look at a lot of this language that is being used around the resistance across the cities, and it's the same sort of language that we use to talk about police brutality in mainstream media. I don't think and I've said this even before the ICE incursions during the Biden administration, I don't think Americans will ever be free until at every traffic stop we see there are people trying to get arrested. And I stand by that. But I do think, a couple of times people were popping tires, and I think that's a good start. There needs to be some form of really, really impeding them, giving it your all. And by the way, thank you for getting arrested. The federal government says differently. But yeah, no, that's if I could sum it up in just one sentence, is I learned that the waves of resistance were strong, but they weren't strong enough. There's still children at Dilly who are eating rotten food, not given medication,
physical manifestation of like just like a fascist agent, and it's just like the morally correct thing to do. Like you're saying, like if somebody is, you're just like witnessing somebody, you know, get kidnapped off of the street, you know, they're pulled over on the highway and they're taken away, but like their babies are left in the car, like their infants. It's like a kind of a look into also what is going on outside of the United States, like what the military is doing, like you know what they did in Iraq, what they do like across the world. So like people are talking about like, oh, you know, this is like imperialism come home, and I'm like, this has always like been here, and also we should care even if it's not like in our streets. So it's like kind of battling against like ICE and all of them is a way to fight U.S. imperialism like domestically, and like there is this demonization of Latinos, you know, Haitians, like with the comments that Trump had made and everything, Somalis, and the government intentionally does that to create like this boogeyman, to kind of like pin these issues and their concerns onto like what you were speaking to earlier, Ellen. And it's like they may have like these valid concerns, like why are these people suddenly, why is the school that's been closed down opening up for people to kind of like stay in? It's like, well, no, that's not the issue. Like they were like sleeping on the streets in the tents in like the winter in Chicago. They are selling candy on the train to like try and make like a living. And this demonization of them, like whether it's in like the media, by like the politicians and everything, it's creating this like manufacturing the consent and like this image to allow this to happen. There's like these conspiracy theories that like people have, and it's like, well, we know who is actually causing these issues that like we face. The ruling class is like right in front of us. They're on TV all the time, espousing their like wild fascist views and everything.